Welcome to the Cookery conversations at the Eco Food Sharing Hub with Aber Food Surplus. My name is Sam and I'm making a use it all up stew with potatoes and beans and tasty things. So I'm going to dice the onion. So firstly, take the top off, straight through the middle, and keep the roots on because the roots hold all the layers together, and that way it comes a lot easier than trying to hold it all together and slipping and sliding around with a knife. So I'll keep my hand flat and go in with the knife towards the root end. I'm just going through it once because it just needs to be roughly diced. And down through the layers. Do the next one. And then when you're chopping, keep your hand hooked, finger there, and that's the guard against where the knife's going to be coming down, so there's no way of getting into your finger. And then move your hand back by the amount you need it. And then you get to this little bit, so you don't have any waste. And that's all the waste that's left. I'll chuck one bit in. I can hear when it starts to get hot. So in the meantime, whilst we wait for that to get hot, we'll just chop up the potato. I think the end is slightly soft. So with anything like this, go straight down the middle. So you make a flat surface. So that way it's steady, so there's no way of sliding around and hurting yourself. And they're very roughly diced at about centimetre cubed. And the same thing, I'm just holding it together with my hand this side, and that thing is the guard. Now this is hot. I'm going to chuck it all in. So you want to make sure the oil is hot before it goes in. Just let that sort of sweat down and start to brown off slightly. Because that way, so when you cook an onion on a lower temperature, you sweat it out and it will just get much sweeter. But I've got this one higher, so it will start to colour. So when it's lower it won't colour, it goes sweet. When it's higher, you will expand the flavour profile, so it will caramelise, so it will go more bitter and sweet. So you end up with much more depth of flavour in it. So we want that as the base of the dish, and then everything else we're just going to build up on top of it. So the dish itself is mainly tomato based, and we're going to have a little bit of orange. I can kind of talk through my approach to food. So with this dish, I think of it as balancing between, I suppose, the saltiness, so the seasoning that's gone into it. The body of it is acid with tomato, reintroducing, so that will get cooked and it will go sweet. We'll reintroduce this fresh acidity with the orange zest and juice. But that's all to balance out the the creamy flavours of the garlic oil, the parsley oil, potatoes and the butter beans. So it's this sort of balancing act between different flavour groups. That's starting to sweat down and get a bit of colour on it. So I'm going to chuck the sweet potato in and we'll start that frying off. So instead of it just being boiled, it might get dropped straight into the stock and the soupiness of it. We'll start it frying and we'll let it stick to the pan a little bit. Again, because it does the same thing with flavour profile. So that way we'll end up, instead of just having boiled potato, we'll have fried and boiled potato. It's Whilst that's doing its thing, get the stock ready. When they start to stick to the pan, you're starting to access like more the an enzyme reaction in the food. So it's either like in meats, it's the Maillard reaction, where you brown things off, and in vegetables and stuff, it's more of a sugar reaction. So you start to caramelise things, which again, you just extend the flavour profile out. So however that thing tastes raw, it starts to taste like the more bitter and the more sweet version of that original ingredient. So I'm cooking it hot, trying to get it to stick to the pan a little bit, with the idea being to then use the stock as a means to deglaze the pan. So deglazing it means we'll pour it in, and the bubbles that it creates will pull all that sticky flavour that's now stuck to the pan before it's burnt back into the food. And that's essentially how you make your gravies, your jus, and all sorts of things like that. So that's sort of just like an understanding of like the idea going into it. See it starting to go like slightly stickier. Because it's quite a naturally sugary, starchy thing, it'll leave things stuck to it. So I'm going to stick the spices in next. And then just let them start to fry up a little bit to release the aromatics, and then the stock can go in. So we'll make sure all the potato and everything's nicely coloured, fry off for just 30 seconds or so. You'll smell the change, and then deglaze and get all the stickiness back off the pan. So yeah, we're going to be using cumin, ground coriander, and a little bit of paprika. You get sweet paprika, sweet smoked paprika, and hot smoked paprika. And the hot smoked paprika has a kick. It's pretty damn tasty. It's starting to get there. Like it's just, you can see that there's like residue stickiness that is just from the vegetables and the sugars that they naturally produce. And I'll get it to this stage, then I'll add the spices, because the spices will just get caught up in it and get stuck in it, and then we'll do that. So you can see how it's browning on the bottom. So, I'm going to be using about 2 tablespoons of cumin, which I'd say is probably all that's left in here. No. So 2 tablespoons of that. 2 tablespoons, remember please, of ground coriander. It smells really good. And we're going with a little bit of a hot paprika. Maybe add a bit more after, he says. So we'll mix that up, let it get all stuck to the pan, and then deglaze that. It's stuck into the kind of the sticky residue in the bottom of the pan. It's really soaked it up. So it's going to make a lot of steam. I don't know if you want to keep that away from it a little bit. So tip that in. You can see how you start mixing that around. It pulls it all back off the bottom of the pan. So if I tip the pan now, it's clean at the bottom. So all that flavour goes back into the dish. I'm going to tip in 1 tin of tomatoes. Chopped tomatoes. I'm just going to chuck the butter beans in as well. And let that bubble away for about 20-25 minutes. The aquafaba that's left in the tin sometimes has quite a strong flavour to it, depending on like if it's chickpeas or kidney beans or butter beans, whatever it is that you've got in it. So sometimes I'll rinse it, sometimes I won't bother. Like it's quite nice. I've known people before kind of cooking like with tins of beans in rice when they're cooking their rice, and they chuck it in with the aquafaba if it's like an aduki bean or something, because it's purple and it stains the rice purple as well, so they want that kind of look of everything just being bright purple. There's obviously different flavour and different types of tomato. So cherry tomatoes are always going to be a lot sweeter, so they're fine to be added into a dish later on. So a tin tomato is very acidic, which is why you cook it to break down the sugars in it, and it will naturally start to sweeten when it changes its colour. Whereas these guys can just get chucked in sort of towards the end, and it reintroduces like a fresh tomato flavour. It's kind of like making a leafy potato soup or something. You chuck in your very floury potatoes at the beginning, and then cook, and they kind of cook down and make the body of the soup, and then kind of 10-20 minutes towards the end, chuck in a couple of very waxy potatoes and blend that in, and it reintroduces kind of like this different layer to the flavours. So after about 10 minutes, I'll chuck these in just whole, and they'll break down enough in the final 10 minutes of cooking that they'll be nice and sweet still. Not going to have like a fresh tomato acidity brought back into the dish. This is going to take a little while. I am just going to be taking the leaves off the stalk of the parsley, just roughly, so we can chop it up and make the parsley oil, which goes on top. This, you can keep the stalks to put any things like this, basil or hard herbs that are woody, like rosemary and thyme and stuff. You can put those. Don't ever cook the woody part of it, because it introduces like a really kind of bitter metallic taste to the food. But you can keep them, put them in oil, and it just infuses the flavour. So you'll have a rosemary oil or a thyme oil or anything like that, and then it's just really nice to cook with. Or a fancy oil, just drizzle it on top of your food afterwards. But these, I'm making more of a kind of like a rough textural kind of thing. So we're going to make it, you can just chuck it all in a food processor, and that's the quicker way of doing it. But if you don't have a food processor, you can do it with a knife really easily, and it just becomes more of a salsa verde style. If any of the leaves are too yellow, you can still use them, but herbs and spices are one of those things that the moment they start to discolour, the flavour is definitely impaired. If you store in bulk spices like this, it's a good idea to keep them out of direct light, because they are sensitive to light and photons, and they will start to, you'll notice they'll change colour, they'll fade a lot, and then they will really start to just not taste as strong at all. It's the same as tea leaves. It's one of those like tragedies. Don't be tempted to try and make this with dried. I think it's much better to do this. Get a fresh herb and then preserve it. Like if you make a parsley oil or a salsa verde or just an infusion, it'll last for as long as you actually have that oil left. Like it's virtually never going to go out of date. And it's a much better way of getting that flavour. But this, like I say, is more going to be just like a standard salsa verde. So we're going to just destroy a garlic. Really finely smash this up, chop it. You can crush it with the side of a knife. Anything that's going to really just break the plant up and get the oils out of it. So when you're chopping up fresh herbs normally, you don't want to be putting pressure on the knife against the board, because you'll notice you'll stain the board green, and that means all of that flavour is now on your chopping board instead. So normally you would end up, you'd pin it down and drag the tip of the knife through them, and that way there's no extra pressure put down and you don't lose the oils. This way, I'm just going to mash it up because we want to break the plant up as much as possible before we mix it with the oil, so that way it has a chance to infuse. Then you can just put it into a clean jar, stick it in your fridge, and keep it there for years if you need it. It just lasts. It's lovely. And it's good for cooking with, but it's really nice just to dress. Like dress it onto a salad, dress it on top of a dish. Basil oil is really nice on a pizza. Really, really nice on a pizza. Slightly concerned that's got a bit too much paprika in it now. Smells very paprika. So I've scrunched that into a little tight ball. And again, it's the same process. Guard with that finger and just go back. When you get to this stage, you can just put your hand on the tip of the knife. And work your way through. Nearly there. You can see it's starting to look really wet. I don't know if you can see that or not. And that wetness is what's going to infuse into the oil. So this oil is going to be very freshly made and then just drizzled on. That's it, that's there. So we don't need too much garlic. If you don't like particularly strong garlic, look for ones that have pink on the inside still, because it's a sign that it is a younger garlic. The flavour won't be anywhere near as astringent, it won't kind of kick you quite so much. It'll just be sweet. I really like garlic, so I'm going to go for a couple of cloves. Crush it so that it looks like that, and then that just comes clean off. So they're crushed. With garlic, depends on how fancy you want to get. When you break garlic, you activate an enzyme that's already present in the plant itself, but it's really heat sensitive. So if you break it or chop it up or whatever, leave it on the chopping board or just leave it cold wherever you're going to cook it for about 10 minutes. It's all it takes. That's what the enzyme's called, I can't pronounce it. But that's all it takes for it to do its work. And it means the flavour of the garlic is a hell of a lot stronger. It just does something where the breaking of it just starts this reaction off and just makes it extra tasty. Then you can cook with it because by that point the enzyme's done its job. But it's super, super nice. I don't know if you want to talk about how fats are really good at taking on flavour and why. The whole principle, if you've ever had like a block of butter in your fridge and some garlic uncovered or half an onion left over or whatever, you can guarantee a block of butter the next morning is going to taste like onion, because fats are notoriously good at taking on odours and flavours from things, which is why it's so good to infuse in them. So they're really good at just taking flavours out of all sorts. In fact, I can't remember the name of the restaurant, but this is like Michelin-starred restaurant that made cigar ice cream, and it's ice cream shaped like a cigar, covered in chocolate and all that sort of stuff, but they did it by blowing cigar smoke just into a chamber across ice cream, just regular ice cream, and it just inherited such a strong smoke flavour from it. So it's really good at taking on odours and sometimes unwanted odours, but in this case, the garlic and the parsley is just going to like enrich the oil really nicely. So again, just guarding. The last thing I want is to be seen on film chopping the very tip of my thumb off. So, now I just tip a good plug. And again, you can tip quite a bit of oil into this, a lot more than that, and then store it in a jar, and it will just infuse and get really nice, and then you can use it for cooking or whatever. Okay, these guys are going to go. Artistic stirring. So, you don't want to make the stalk of kale, because it is seriously stringy and fibrous, so we're just going to pull, roughly rip all the leaves off it. And it's one of these things that, because of the nature of how quickly it cooks, we can chuck it in pretty much towards the end of the dish, as it only takes 5 minutes or so. These we're just going to rip. It's quite a nice way of treating kale for a salad. It's just to bruise it. Like breaking it up by hand is just a way of starting that plant fibre to soften up a little bit. And then you can just drizzle it with some oil, mix it with some, I don't know, pecans or walnuts and dried fruit. Leave it in your fridge for half an hour, and by that point it's all softened up and it's super tasty. That's all going to go in. And that will lose a lot of volume as it cooks. And lastly, ginger and orange. Let's go for a nice thumb-sized bit. Always measure. The orange. I'm going to use, not going to bother peeling it because the skin should stay on the outside if you're grating. So go in with the flat side of that. So you can see how the fibre stays on the outside, which is what's holding the skin together still. Move that out of the way. And then more or less the stuff on the inside. These are going to go in at the end because we want a nice little bit of fieriness. Then we're going to have some juice and some zest in the orange. So I'm just going to go on the same side. And when zesting an orange, you want the skin. Don't go into the pith, so the white part of it. That's where it's really, really bitter. So the juice, the plant, like the body of the fruit, and the skin are all really tasty, but the pith is the really bitter bit. So when you're zesting, just that's as dark as you want it, as light as you want it to go. So the orange goes in. So now I'm just going to go with half the orange worth of juice, because the stew itself has reduced quite a lot. It's gone really thick, which is good because it means you've removed all the water, so the flavour is really concentrated. But because we want it to be a bit runnier again, we're going to add the citrus back in. But you don't want to overcook citrus, so the flavour goes nasty. So we're going to give a squeeze of this in right at the end. That's how we're done. It's quite thick, but that's sort of as intended. You don't want it to be a soup, you want it to be. Maybe do a little artistic drizzle, see if it looks